But this is the lightning talk round, and when we get through the whole, this is the first row of people here. If there's time left over, then we're going to do general Q&A. So, Holly, you get to start off. Holly Inglis. And the title of her talk is Hearers and Doers, Becoming a Whole Brain Church.
The emotion or the lack of emotion that you associate with my lightning talk will dictate what you remember about what I'm about to say. As a Doctor of Educational Ministry candidate at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, my project will study the impact of creating memorable learning in the worship, mission, and education of a congregation, utilizing 5 tips for creating memorable learning in the church, derived from my research in the practicum phase of my study, which I completed in 2009. And those 5 tips are: what you see is what you remember. Stimulate the senses, and vision trumps all senses. What you know is what you remember. Engage new information with prior knowledge. What you feel is what you remember. Create an emotional connection. Emotional memory trumps all other forms of memory. What you repeat is what you remember. Create an emotional connection. Finding your core message and repeating it with increasing depth, repeating what you remember. And then what is relevant to you is what you remember. Demonstrate relevance and create interest for your learners. So by applying those 5 tips to the content and the process of worship, education, and mission, I'm going to use case studies of the faith experiences of individuals to determine how those 3 areas can be made more sticky or memorable to enhance the transference of information and learning outside the church. Why? Survival and blossoming of the church in the 21st century necessitates that we look beyond simply a change of style in worship or our method of education. Survival and growth demands that we learn to do what we do in a way that makes an impact on participants that is personally transformative and therefore results in transformation of their presence in the world. This suggestion is informed by recent cognitive neuroscience that research tells us how we learn and how we create memory, and assumes that the goal of faith activity is to form and transform individuals so that they may act transformatively in the world. It's my assertion that the educational process begins with an individual's awareness of their own experience, and that experience is deepened by the larger context of the community, culturally, theologically, and biblically. The individual integrates their awareness and discovery of their experience with the results of their explorations and then returns out into the world to live out their new understandings in the context of their everyday life. These steps are undertaken in the context of participation in a community of faith, and together we reform and reshape our thinking and our behavior. My model is based on a shared praxis model of experience, reflection, integration, and action. And it's recursive as individuals continue to return to the community because their experience in the outside world no longer fits with their prior understandings. As they live in the world, they encounter new experiences. And because of the transformation that they're experiencing within the community, they will think and therefore act differently. These new experiences are then brought back to the community where the process begins again. Now, the exciting thing is that this process actually reflects the electric and electrochemical processes that our brains undergo each time we create memory. My process utilizes this understanding of how our brains work and maximizes the opportunities for learning and transformation, as well as measuring and evaluating the effectiveness of applying a whole brain approach to the education, worship, and mission setting of a church. I'm excited about next year's topic in Toronto, and I look forward to submitting a paper for consideration and contributing to the emerging, and I believe necessary, conversation between cognitive neuroscience and religious education.
And a minute to spare. This is Horell, and his title is Education for Peace and Justice as a Constitutive Dimension of Religious Education.
In 2005, the REA annual meeting theme was Religious Education for Peace and Justice. And the theme of Educating for Peace and Justice has been woven into most of our annual meetings. On a more general level, all dimensions of religious education can be envisioned as including a focus on education for peace and justice. There is a conceptual dimension to religious education. Religious education includes learning about our own and other religious traditions. On a formational level, religious education can also lead us to a deeper understanding of and relationship with God. Moreover, when we study the religious traditions of the world, we learn that most of them teach that faith demands justice, that God calls us to be a people who seek greater peace and justice in the world, especially for the poor and oppressed. There are personal and social dimensions to religious education. Many educational forms, including forms of religious education, include emphases on helping people develop their talents and gifts and learning how to relate to and collaborate with others more fully. Moreover, the development of moral qualities and character is an essential dimension of personal development. And learning how to relate justly and fairly to others and to be concerned for the common good of society are essential dimensions of social development. Religious education can never be reduced to education for peace and justice. Yet, I would argue that education for peace and justice should be an integral part of all comprehensive forms of religious education. I invite all of you to help me think about education for peace and justice as an integral dimension of religious education. Specifically, the past few years I have chaired the organization's Task Force on Peace and Justice. I invite you to join this task force and to share your ideas about this important issue with me or any of the other task force members. More importantly, I welcome your ideas about specific issues we might focus on together to highlight education for peace and justice as a constitutive dimension of religious education. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Rabbi Shire, and his title is A Commemoration of Kristallnacht.
This follows directly on from Baird, without me knowing. In my Jewish community, today would be and is the anniversary of the night of Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, 72 years ago, when most of all the Jewish synagogues in Germany were burnt to the ground, and shops and Jewish businesses were ransacked, and the glass that was left on the streets gave name to the day, including my grandfather's shop in Germany. Our commemoration on this day is perhaps a message for all of us as religious educators. We have many opportunities around the world to think about the Shoah, the Holocaust, but today I think the commemoration of Kristallnacht has a particular meaning, and it is the meaning that this night was a warning for the Jews in Germany particularly, but perhaps for all of us today, that for them that there was to be no future for Jews in Germany, and that the well-minded and democratic operations of a state, a modern state, a civilized state, let the mob rule the streets and take over a civilized country. And there's a warning for all of us, those who are like-minded, those who are involved in religious work, to be warned again that we are still facing the dangers, and some of those dangers come from within our own religious traditions. That if we ask people on the street what are the dangers to the clash of civilizations, it is, in many people's minds, religion. And therefore that we must work harder for justice and peace within our own religious traditions and across our religious traditions. As Hans Kung said, we are no longer independent of each other, but rather interdependent. And so as we think about the events of that night 22 years ago, I think again we are called to mind about the work that we are already doing, which is of course supremely important. And as we grow personally in our work, we also think about growing as a community of peoples who wish to seek justice and peace for all. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Dean Blevins, whose title is Embracing Science and Technology.
Basically, this is just a brief invitation to a new task force that will begin tomorrow on science and technology. And in some ways, even though it's a gathering of a task force, it's also sort of a gathering around the water hole, if you will, to begin to think together about these themes, these dual themes, and their implication for religious education. Envisioning that the task force will take on science as a research-based conversation partner, particularly the physical sciences and medicine. Already you know that the first and foremost possible theme would be that of neuroscience and its relationship to various aspects, including religious experience, neuroeducation, definitions of mind and person and the relationships of those, some of the new work in neurodevelopmental markers for children and youth, and one that might be of interest to some is the ethics of neuroenhancement, which is taking up quite a bit of conversation these days, and what is our role within religious education and understanding that. However, science is a larger category, so we may also, as a task force, depending on the interest, take on such issues as genetics and genetics engineering, or medical ethics and the growing concern with the rise of an aging population and what does that mean for us. So this would be a place to begin possibly a conversation around there. The other major focus of the task force, and we may end up being two task forces, is really seeing technology as a disciplinary conversation partner. The idea that in some ways the means of education and the methods that we use are inherently attached to each other, and what does it mean to take seriously the kinds of technology and how that shapes and influences the nature of our educational practice. Some suggested ideas that may attract you include, of course, one that is the elephant in the room, which is online pedagogy, and the way that's shaping a number of our institutions today. But also themes that some of which we've heard here already, but gaming and the role of video games in education, social networking, the rise of new media, which we've heard a lot about, but also other types of themes that may intrigue you, such as the advent of the speculative idea of transhumanism and its implications as basically technology and personhood merge together. The understanding of the internet primarily as an aesthetic and religious art form in and of itself, part of that we've also sort of been introduced to. And one other type of technology some of you are probably aware of, which is bio-based technology, basically robots and other forms of technology that are based on living human tissue and the implications for those types of technologies and its relationship to religious ed. We'll use the time primarily for planning this time around based on interest. I will have a project to introduce that is connected to next year's theme, and you've already seen that. And wanted to talk a little bit about it because there that's a big word here, there may be the possibility of some grant funding in relationship between neuroscience and religious education. So I just wanted to introduce that as something for us to begin to think about this year in anticipation for next year.
You guys are doing such a good job, I don't even really need to moderate. Our next speaker is Rabbi Justus Baird, and actually I don't have a title, so I'm afraid you get to use up some of your time.
One of the deep learnings in interfaith work that I've gained over the last few years is that by airing your own dirty laundry in public, you can often create intimacy more quickly. So I'm going to engage in the practice of airing a little Jewish dirty laundry, which is that increasingly there's a growing consensus, at least in the American Jewish community, and a growing consensus in any Jewish community is actually something to pause and think about, that our supplementary religious education, so I'm talking about, the equivalent of Sunday school, not everything but day school, if you will, is broken, or maybe even dead. That there's really a sense that our synagogue-based learning models are, to use a Hebrew word, are gosses. They're like right before you die. They're like just like whispering breath, like right to go. So I am experimenting with some alternative forms of Jewish education in central Jersey, and the only reason I know that I might be onto something is because all the local rabbis in town are totally freaked out. The rabbis called me and gave me a big finger pointing, and so finally I'm on. What what we're doing is experimenting with sort of the three legs of our educational approach right now. One is family-based, really privileging family-based learning. So, Deuteronomy 6 teaches Vishinant and Levanecha, right? That we're obligated to pass along the tradition from parent to child. The second part is it totally privileges experiential learning, not in a summer camp model, but every day. We have no classrooms, we have no desks, it's completely experiential. Judaism as a halakha, as a way of life, I believe should be learned by doing. It's not a subject in school. And finally, it's a self-paced, learner-based, or what Mary Hesman called agency-oriented learning model, taking a page out of the Scout educational model or karate, where there are ranks and requirements and people proceed through them at their own pace. We have no paid teachers. Parents are the primary facilitators. Much of the learning happens in home and in community. And we're in our second pilot year. We're having a great time. So why am I saying all this? My request is, if any of you in your communities are doing similar work or have done research on similar supplementary religious education that privileges some of these techniques, I would love to benefit from the work that's been happening in other religious communities. I've heard from a little bit of research that, for instance, Catholic communities have done quite a lot of family-based learning, but in the Jewish world, these things are considered very new. So that's my request, and it's been great to be here.
Continue to be amazed that everybody's staying under their limit. Okay, Claire Bischoff, and her title is How Does Transformation Happen?
Let's start.
So how does individual transformation happen? I first started to answer this question by comparing the work of Paulo Freire and Robert Keegan. And many of you, I'm going to rehearse what you already know. For Freire, transformation happens through the intimately connected steps of critical thought and critical action. A person comes to critical knowledge about their place in the world and then takes critical action to effect a change in their social situation. Freire is also clear that transformation will only happen when educators meet those they're working with where they are. For Keegan, transformation happens through the 3 C's: confirmation, contradiction, and continuity. After having one's knowledge or reality affirmed, a person may experience contradiction, which leads them to differentiate from their previous knowledge or reality. A chance for reintegration to achieve some continuity between what you used to know and what you now know completes the movement. While there are surely marked differences in Freire and Keegan's work, a comparison suggests that to promote transformation, educators need to invite self-reflection, encounters with difference, and moments for integration. To speak very broadly, change happens when we have our current reality affirmed, face a new reality through some encounter with difference, and are able to integrate our old and our new ways of knowing. Then, I read someone from a completely different context, Saba Mahmoud's Politics of Piety, which exposes some of the bias in Freire and Keegan's work and suggests a different model of how transformation happened. Mahmoud worked with women in Egypt who were converting to Islam. These women joined the mosque movement because they want to become good Muslims for themselves and for their families. To become a good Muslim woman means aligning your desires with those that are socially prescribed by Islam, such as humility and charity. In contrast to a westernized notion of self where we act out of an internal disposition, these women believe that they could shape their internal dispositions by taking on particular practices. In other words, they believe that modest and virtuous actions shape the modest and virtuous self. Agency isn't about resistance, but about taking on practices, such as veiling, that allow them to be the people they desire to be. Putting these 3 people in conversation helps remind us that theories of transformation are always tied to contextual visions of self and full human flourishing. In a Western Enlightenment context, in which we often read Freire and Keegan, the notion of an autonomous self who achieves that self through separation and splitting of consciousness, that makes sense to us on some level. Even when we've been trained to have some misgivings about the possibility and the sustainability of an autonomous self, the importance of the consciousness-raising experience still runs deep in this context. But in the Islamic context that Mahmoud describes, and I would argue also in a Christian context, a different understanding of the self is operative. Here, a person is called to prayerfully receive the self from God and shape the self through practices that bring the self even more closely in line with the ideals and exemplars in the tradition. For the young Christian women in the United States with whom I work, I'm becoming increasingly convinced that both of these understandings of transformation need to be put together. So to have a chance to practice using practices to shape the self, and also using practices of reflection to shape thought and action. As members of Christian congregations, young women are asked to live into their status as Imago Dei and Imago Christi, receiving the identity given them by God and following the example of Christ. They can express agency by participating in practices of prayer and worship and other practices that assist them in conforming their lives to Christ's examples. Yet these young women also still live in a society and participate in a church in which patriarchy and sexism still function. In order to challenge the systemic forces that limit their opportunities and ways of being in the world, they need to be able to think critically about this world and their place in it. Here their agency does come from separating their desires from the socially prescribed desires in order to resist forces that limit their full flourishing. So the question I'm thinking about is, what does this all mean for religious educators? And for those of you who were at Lisa Kimball and Patricia Lyon's talk this morning, how might imagination really provide the link between these two different types of understanding of transformation?
So I think this is going to be kind of fun to see how it works. Elsbeth Visser-Vogel and Janneke Westerink, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, and their title is The Religious Identity Development of Strict Believing Adolescents.
Good afternoon, my name is Elsbeth Visser and I'm with Janneke Westerink from the Netherlands. This year we started our PhD project about a current and relevant theme in Holland. It is about strict religious youngsters from two different religions, Christians and Muslims. Both groups differ in life and practice from the mainstream of society. In the media, these groups are often portrayed negatively. Schools and parents experience difficulties in educating them. We are interested in them and want to give a scientific description of these groups. We are especially interested in the religious identity development. We call this group of strict believing adolescents Orthodox and Orthoprax. We prefer this name above fundamentalist, also a common name to indicate strict believers, because it has a negative connotation in the Netherlands. We consider adolescents as Orthodox and Orthoprax if they agree with all the following four elements. 1. A sacred scripture contains the exclusive and inherent truth about humanity and deity. 2. Religion is meaningful for the totality of life. 3. A strong internal cohesion between members and institutes. 4. A critical attitude toward modern society.
So we will study the religious identity development of Orthodox and Orthodox religious adolescents in a qualitative way for 3 reasons. Firstly, we observe a lack in research about religious identity development, especially of strict believing youngsters. Less than 1% of articles in the social sciences on children and adolescents address religious development explicitly. Secondly, most of these studies are quantitative. There are very few studies that qualitatively examine the role of religion in adolescent identity development. Thirdly, existing studies are limited in a way researchers hardly listen to the youngsters themselves, in their specific situations and with their personal experience, like our pharmacy. For that reason, we choose to study the religious identity development from an adolescent perspective. What makes the study special is the comparison between youngsters of 2 religions. One of us will investigate Christian adolescents and one Muslim adolescents. In the end, we will compare our findings. To conclude, we hope our research project will result in a scientific description of Orthodox and Orthodox adolescents with a focus on their religious identity development from the perspective of the adolescents themselves. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Kevin Sandberg, and the title is Neither Mosque Nor Ground Zero, Cordova House, Politics and Religious Education.
Good afternoon, everybody. Does it feel good to breathe? You can breathe. Sign. Stretch. Need it? Now that the midterm elections are behind us, the controversy surrounding Cordova House the Islamic Community Center, which is to be built 2 blocks from Ground Zero in New York City, might disappear from the news, but the issue will remain. I have heard some of my fellow doctoral students follow the media-modeled practice of referring to Cordoba House as a mosque at Ground Zero. So I cannot presume that you yourselves know that it is neither mosque nor at Ground Zero. It is more accurately described as an Islamic cultural community center 2 blocks away from Ground Zero. The mission of Cordoba House is to strengthen relations between the Western and Muslim worlds and to help counter radical ideology in what amounts to a multi-faith, multinational effort. Some politicians, such as New York City's mayor and President Obama, have had the courage to defend the constitutional right to build Cordoba House. Some ministers have had the courage to insist that the proponents of Cordoba House not be demonized. Similarly, religious educators must have the courage to ask why such rights remain suspect to so many religious practitioners, and why demonizing the religious other gains political currency so easily. Now, I am merely a transplant to New York City, and only for 16 months at that. I'm certain that there are others in attendance at the conference who are more familiar with the situation of Cordoba House, even if they are not proximate to Ground Zero, both experientially in terms of the 9/11 event itself, and geographically in terms of living or working in that lower Manhattan neighborhood. But I can share with you a concern that I think should preoccupy all religious educators, namely the political co-opting of religious community and practice. This affects the very language that people, including religious educators, use to consider Cordoba House and events such as 9/11. Perhaps the classic religious event of the 21st century, to use David Tracy's concept. Political use of Cordoba House serves to establish a key premise of the Republican Party's effort to defeat President Obama in the 2012 presidential election. It's based on the premise that America is a Christian nation. And if America is a Christian nation, the argument goes, how can the United States have a Muslim president? You might consider the notion of Obama being considered a Muslim ridiculous or preposterous, given that he has publicly proclaimed his Christianity, or even inconsequential. But after the success of the Tea Party and the declaration of Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate Minority Leader, that the Republican Party's principal goal is to defeat Obama in 2012, such rhetoric should no longer be dismissed or taken lightly. During the fall campaign season, for example, participants at the Conservative Values Voters Summit were told that each mosque is dedicated to the overthrow of the American government. The anger at the heart of such political language is pre-rational. But the caricatures that it spawns, nonetheless, are quite strategic. They are designed with 2 intents in mind. First, to misrepresent the opponent, Muslims especially, as terrorists, or Obama in particular. And second, to establish a complex of martyrdom around those who speak such falsehoods. In the latter case, the strategy is to depict assaults on the intelligence of such perennial candidates as Sarah Palin as assaults on their followers, everyday Joe and Jane Americans. Where then might religious educators turn for guidance? To Houston Smith and to Martin Marty.
I'm interested in hearing stories from you all if you happen to be part of a Christian congregation that's fighting about sex these days. Because I've been doing research on congregations in conflict with their own denominations over sexuality. And this has been a study funded by the Louisville Institute, an ethnography in which I've done close-grained work with 3 different communities. One, an Episcopal church that's a continuing congregation after former priest took out about 40 members and went to one of the Cana congregations being established. Another, a Presbyterian church that struggles about why it should stay in the Presbyterian denomination, given how slow Presbyterians have been to change their policies to be more affirming. And then the third one, an ELCA congregation in Atlanta, Georgia, that hired an openly gay pastor and then had to fight with their denomination about keeping him and about staying part of the ELCA. So it's been a wild ride and it's been fun. I want to tell you a couple things that I've found out in the study and invite you on the fly to share your stories with me because I'm really hungry for them. I've tried to learn about how theology shapes the way congregations fight, which is a really interesting question, and to explore the way that fighting within one's own bloodline changes the practices of conflict. And I've tried to look at how congregations continue to nurture the faith of children, youth, and other newcomers to the faith when they are in conflict, because conflict happens in congregations, but faith formation also continues. So what does that look like? And then to explore the possibility that conflict itself is a faith practice, that the way we fight may also be the way they will know we are Christians by our conflict practices. So that's been what I've sort of been looking at and up to. Quick conclusion, I'm just going to talk till the clock runs out. So. Conflict over sexuality is a lot more like the identity-based conflicts that happen between nations, think Bosnia, Herzegovina, than it is like the interest-based conflicts that take place that can be resolved by Harvard Business School models of negotiating down from what you start out wanting to the common interests that you have at stake and then going to the lowest common denominator. When identity is the thing at stake, you cannot negotiate down to a lowest common denominator. And so that accounts for part of the reason that these conflicts in congregations are so intractable. They're much more like identity-based conflicts. The media's role in conflict, I mentioned in my remarks yesterday, but I want to say that in these cases what I've found is that local fights in congregations quickly become connected to the global conflicts about sexuality in which the global South churches are exerting power in ways that the global North churches are not accustomed to dealing with. And so we've got issues of race and power and economics, where a little tiny local church's fight suddenly becomes appended onto the cause of the national church in Nigeria. And so it's a different fighting situation than perhaps has been before. It's really hard for people to stay together at the table after these fights. It's really hard. The congregations that have been through conflicts, when you look for where the losers are, they're somewhere else. The people who did not survive the battle as winners also didn't stay in the congregation unless there's something more compelling, like their participation with a group or a program that they allow to override their concern about this particular issue. And then children and youth get easily overlooked, but they experience the conflict most often in terms of relationship and loss. And the grief that happens is formative in their experience of church. And I think we need to be paying attention to that, especially as religious educators. And then last, in all three of these churches, trauma became the big theme. Trauma. Fighting brings up, it's a trauma trigger. And so a lot of the literature on trauma, trauma therapy, understanding how people deal with the experience of a perceived or actual situation of being overwhelmed and not having adequate coping resources to deal with that fits this situation of conflict in congregations. And there's another one, ask me later, I'll tell you about it.
And actually, I don't know, maybe Cyril would like it, but Dr. Cyril J. Souza is our next speaker, and his title is An Attempt at Understanding the Dynamics of Enculturation.
This is the first time that I'm taking part in an REA meeting. It's the first time also that I heard about lightning talks. I like the general concept, but reading through the guidelines, I seem to feel that if I exceed 5 minutes, lightning will strike me. To avoid that, let me get straight down to the topic. I study, research, and lecture in the field of religious education and anthropology. Among the different themes that this topic touches, I'm interested particularly in the interaction between evangelization or catechesis and culture. In the field of religious education, it could boil down to the relationship between religious education and cultures, or how to engage in religious education within the interaction with the interference of culture. This study has brought me in touch with different approaches in the course of the centuries. Some call it adaptation, others assimilation, still others integration. We also have indigenization or incarnation. But I am particularly interested in inculturation. This term inculturation has bad history. And whenever I tell people that I am working in the field of inculturation and catechesis, they look at me with suspicion, with doubt, or simply ask, but is it not passé? Should we not talk about contextualization, intercultural approaches, re-acculturation? Some of these topics are in the lectures that we are hearing today, these days. I still find a lot of meaning and sense in inculturation, and I intend to pursue my studies still. The point is, inculturation has different nuances in different parts of the world, in different contexts. In Asia, we have a strong tendency or a strong tradition of inculturation. It's enough to think about Matteo Ricci, who centuries ago, with his inculturation of Christianity and the Chinese culture, was able to adopt their understanding of God as the supreme Lord of the universe, or of the funeral rites of the Chinese, or ancestor worship, or honor or due to Lao Tse-tung. Then we have got Roberto De Nobili in India, who interacted with the cultural system of caste and the Tamil literature. We have Alexander de Rhodes in Vietnam, who not only had the benefit of getting a scripture through his work, but also he presented the catechism in the concepts or in the cultural expressions of the Vietnamese. Or Thomas Stevens, who came from England and was in my place, Goa, where he wanted to use our mother tongue to develop the whole history of Jesus Christ. He had to interact with the Vaishnavite Hindu tradition and presented the Krishna Purana, the history of Jesus, in Vaishnavite Hindu images. So we got a lot of traditions in this. Not only this, also in the field of the studies. There are lots of definitions, not only in Asia but all over the world. We have it, for instance, in the European context by Ari Roscrovius or by Pedro Arrupe, who speak about inculturation for clerical and religious formation. Or in the African context by Schotter and by Justin Gupkong with regard to the missionary work in Africa. Or in the North American context, Dermot Lane and Thomas Kroom, who speak about inculturation in catechesis or in the pastoral field. Or in the Latin American context, where Leonardo Boff speaks about inculturation for the empowerment of the people in their life over there. So also in the Asian context, we have, for instance, Jose de Mesa in the Philippine context, who speaks about inculturation for presenting Christ. Or T.S. Amror Pavadas in India, with a particular response to spirituality of the Hindu spirituality in Christianity. A deeper study of all these resources will certainly help us to provide the mechanism for a more effective enculturation. And this is what I intend to do, to continue this kind of a study. As it is, I have been able to draw some of the theoretical foundations that are possible. The hermeneutical dimension, for instance, with linguistics, or the cultural, or the abductive hermeneutics, or Hans Gatter's fusion of horizons, or the correlation dimension where two different poles, culture and faith, get into interaction and
and now we have Matthew Geiger, and his title is Religious Pluralism Pedagogy.
Thank you. This is my first meeting at the REA, and it's been wonderful for a lot of reasons, and I'm hoping that a lot will come out of it. I teach high school along with Tricia, who I don't see her at the moment, Tricia and Dr. Kimball from BTS, who gave a workshop earlier today. We both teach high school at an Episcopal school in Alexandria, Virginia, and I'm also working on a doctorate degree at Virginia Theological Seminary. What I've been doing is trying to find ways in which some of our broader concerns that have been voiced over the last 24 hours here, again and again, can be incorporated into curricular settings, traditional educational settings. What I want to think about here to open with is a question that I wanted to ask Parker Palmer, but didn't get a chance to. And what I wanted to say was there has been all this talk and sort of meditation on these beautiful, beautiful words and concepts like soul, vocation, the inner life, interiority, right? Listening, right? And wanting to be heard, young people desiring more than anything else to have a voice, to want to be heard by us. And what I wanted to ask him was concretely, very specifically, how do we do this? What are the ways in which because we all know what the problem is, but the question is, and I'm an educator, and I'm dumbfounded by this every single day that I set foot in a classroom. I don't know if other people have this experience, but how exactly do we do that, right? What are the techniques? What are the ways in which we can come together and share ideas about specific ways of engaging, especially young people, in religious education? So what I've been working on in the past couple of years is, and this comes out of my own original failure with being a teacher. When I first started teaching, I was trying to teach New Testament to sophomores in high school, just like Margaret Mitchell at Chicago taught it to me in the Chicago High School. And it didn't work at all. And so I had to start rethinking this. And what I began to do was take seriously their voices and trying to meet them where they were. And I know that we all say that's what we want to do as teachers. The question is, how exactly do we do that again, right? It's not the easiest thing to do. So I've been working on developing forms of reflective exercises, which I broadly call spiritual exercises, and incorporate that into the curriculum with the sole intention of trying to do something like find ways in which young people can find deep, meaningful, lasting connections between the soul and the content that we are engaging with, whether it's a text, whether it's a doctrine, whether it's a symbol, okay, so on and so forth, to find deep and meaningful relationships that can be solidified therein. And this all comes out of the really, really good work that the new youth ministry people have been doing, which is take young people seriously, and also what Atella has been doing with Interfaith Youth Corps, take them seriously and engage their deep desire for agency. And then that's what makes possible, right, the conditions to have something like, after they navigate this long, long period of emerging adulthood, and they're 30 years old and they come into your church, and they can then begin to immediately tell their story. What is my story? This is it because I've been doing this, I've developed these techniques, these tools of theological reflection, which helped me. Is that the 1 minute? Or is that
That's the 1 minute.
Okay, great. I thought that was it. So to help them have tools that they can put in their pockets for the next, so from when they're 16 to 26 to 30, that they have these resources to draw upon, which are basically the tools of creating ways to engage them with theological reflection on their life story and their imaginative vision of their future, their vocation, their loves, cares, concerns, desires, what is worth living and dying for. So that's what my workshop is going to be on this afternoon. It's going to be I'm going to be giving examples of a lot of things I've been trying out with the students, and you'll get to hear their voices. And I would just love, what I want to know, there's so much wisdom in this room, what are other better ways also to do it? Thank you.
Did I say it right? Yes. And her title is Teaching Spiritual Discernment.
Thank you all so much just for staying awake this long after our delicious but very heavy lunch and this delicious but very heavy rush of birds among birds. I appreciate your attention. The reason I am up here is that I am interested in finding if there's anyone else who might be interested in forming a session for next year's annual meeting on the topic of teaching spiritual discernment in light of controversies among cognitive scientists about decision making. Specifically, controversies about the possibility of genuine human choice, and especially the possibility of choosing genuinely unselfish social action. For 8 years, I focused my teaching and my writing in Christian education and Christian spirituality on 2 topics: spiritual discernment and peace education. I've done this because our planet is at risk because of selfish human choices. We need to discern how we can act unselfishly on behalf of all our fellow creatures, and we need to learn how to make social decisions peacefully, both in the small family, social circle, and globally. I'm 3/4 of the way finished with a 3-volume series with a working title of Teaching Christian Discernment in a Planet at Risk. The first book explores Christian approaches to spiritual discernment, which I describe as the interaction of God's guidance and human choice. I make this exploration in the light of neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research on decision-making, altruism, and emotion. What I'd like to present next year is a chapter of this book. My second manuscript explores the fact that there's quite a few effective Christian social activists who practice both Ignatian and Zen meditation aimed at spiritual discernment for social change. I explore 2 networks that are currently practicing both Zen and Ignatian meditation to support their spiritual discernment for social change. And I review this practice in light of the practical theology of spiritual discernment that I've proposed in the first book. The third book, which honestly I've only written 1 chapter for, reviews student feedback and my own teacher notes to myself while I've been teaching over the past 8 years 6 times a course that I call Christian Discernment and Social Action. And it's a praxis research model, obviously. And I've done this at Princeton Seminary and Phillips Seminary and St. Joseph's University. University. Great Jesuit place to do this. And students in all of these courses practiced both Zen and Ignatian meditation, and then wrote lots of feedback about that experience. So, if anybody is interested in helping with a session on teaching Christian discernment or teaching spiritual discernment, I'm secretary of the Buddhist Christian Studies Association, so I'd love to have some Buddhists too. Please get in touch with me. Thanks so much for your attention.
And now we have Dr. Charlene Jin Lee, and her title is Phenomenological Pedagogy and Religious Education.
I'm a practical theorist and teacher interested in those spaces of convergence where assumed notions of universality that's part of any established discourse is interrupted by particular descriptions. And in my recent inquiry on phenomenology has hijacked my attention and my time because it, for me, provides entry point into the discourse with a capital D in ways that where I can find ways to converge space, find space for responding to what I see as a need for the theory of the unique. Phenomenology is a rigorous study of the life world, the biographic situation, that first order primal experience of being human, and it rejects rationalism, it rejects empiricism, because they fail to depict thought as it occurs in lived time. There are 2 points of learning in this inquiry that I'm exploring. The first one is that this investigation on lived experience of the individual does not suggest introspection in the way that education is no more intensely personal as it is intensely political. And Maxine Green has been especially helpful for me in articulating this very critical point, where she explains that human consciousness moves toward the world, not away from it. And so this simultaneously communal and particular notion available in phenomenology is helpful for me in constructing a framework for teaching identity and context in the seminary classroom. And the second point of learning that I'm exploring is this aesthetic quality of the human experience that's recognized in phenomenology. Phenomenology is often described as a way of presenting an original singing of the world, a voicing of experience in ways that logic and numbers and statistics do not capture. And so this idea of poeticizing the learning experience is intriguing to me. And this mode of research legitimizes the poetical activity. And that's a helpful source for me as it converges with my thinking about the necessary of poetics for understanding curriculum in the ways that developing curriculum does not have time for. And so the question that I'm pondering upon is, what does it mean for me to understand curriculum as phenomenological text in my own thinking and practice? And the larger implicative question that I might dare to ask is what might a poeticizing of the MDiv curriculum in a mainline Protestant seminary look like? What would it require? What would it look like to inject phenomenological pedagogy as a way of interrupting the linear process of education/training that we like to call formation, that dictates the preparation of leaders for the church and for the world?
Next up, Cassie Myers with the title, Why Interfaith Cooperation?
So when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about with all of you for 5 minutes, I thought I wanted to talk about something that you would remember, that post-lunch haze, that you would remember as you went back to your respective schools and places of work. So I thought about the lecture that I just heard Robert Putnam give about his new book with David Campbell, American Grace, and a couple of the tidbits that really stuck in my head and that I've been mulling over since I heard him speak earlier this week, and how those, I think, give us an imperative to think about interfaith cooperation when we think about interreligious engagement within religious education. So, imagine if you will, since I don't have slides, I'm going to draw the graph for you guys from some of Putnam and Campbell's data. So, here's your x-axis and your y-axis. And what this graph measures is sort of feeling of good-naturedness or affinity that you have to a religious group other than your own. So up here is where we have those groups that the most number of Americans have good feelings towards, and down here, most number of Americans have not so great feelings towards. So, turns out, most popular group, according to Putnam and Campbell's research, Jews. They're up there, they're way at the top. About 80% of Americans say that they have good feelings towards Jews. Congratulations. Below Jews, Catholics. That's kind of surprising, right? When you think about the two groups in America who face the most religious discrimination in the last, at the turn of the last century, into maybe the 50s, 60s, even 70s, probably Catholics and Jews. Pretty interesting. Mainline Protestants and the non-religious come a little bit below that. Then you have the 50% line, and below that you start to get evangelicals. They're pretty close to 50% of Americans who have fine feelings towards evangelicals. And you move down, and at the very bottom, and also on this graph, you can imagine the circles that represent these different religious traditions are relative to the size of that tradition, relative to the population. So very far down here at the bottom, you have a little tiny dot that represents Muslims. Probably not surprised, right? We've heard already, I think, some of the things that would make that finding not so surprising to us. So what can we learn from how Catholics and Jews have become some of the more popular religions? Well, Putnam and Campbell talk about something called the Pal-Al phenomenon, and that's where you can hear stereotypes about a particular religious tradition, you can have ideas about that tradition, but then when you have a Pal-Al, or maybe a Pal-Justus, or a Pal, I don't know, a stereotypical Catholic name, or a Pal-Ahmed, maybe, that's when you start to shift your perceptions of those people. When you actually have that friend and you've had relationships with that person, that's when you can start to have different ideas. Now, the trick for Muslims is that they're relatively concentrated geographically, so there's not as many opportunities for people to get to know them, and they're a relatively small part of the population. So the question for us is, how do we create more Pal-Als or Pal-Ahmeds or Pal-Aliyas, as the case may be? I think there's a real imperative for us to think about how we're creating those opportunities for engagement as people who are concerned with these issues. Now, one of the other things that Putnam and Campbell have found is that you can educate, you can give knowledge about these different religious traditions, but there's a lot of data, and there's a great study that just came out of Ohio State University that suggested knowledge that tried to counter negative images of Muslims in the media wasn't that effective. So if you said, it's not true, it's not actually a mosque, and it's not actually at ground zero, and Imam Faisal isn't actually a terrorist, even accurate knowledge about that didn't change people's perceptions. And even initial relationships might not have the possibility to change perceptions. What's really, really powerful is when people of different backgrounds work together on an issue of common concern. Knowledge is important, relationship is important, but the most important thing, a true sort of Pal-Al, Putnam and Campbell find, is working together on an issue of common concern, saying, I, as a Christian, care about this same issue that my Pal-Aliyah as a Muslim cares about. And so what is the imperative for us as religious educators to think about how we are creating more opportunities for that?
Second talk this afternoon, and then we'll open up for questions, is from Chuck Chesnovich, and his title is Interreligious Prayer.
Thank you, and I need to stretch myself because I've been sitting as long as you. Want to just stand up a second? I know we're going to be walking soon. Just stand up. What the heck, right? I was stiff just now. Beautiful. Put your arms straight up in the air, lock your elbows. Take in a deep breath and stretch. Hands through the ceiling, feet through the floor. Exhale, bring your arms down. Beautiful. Thank you. the past 6 years I've been hosting an interreligious prayer service, bringing together the world religions to pray. My general theory is this: if you're willing to pray together, you're less likely to want to kill each other. I think we'd all pretty much agree with that. But yeah, I also know it's a very hot topic. It's one that people like to dismiss and avoid, and there's a lot of resistance to it. My interest is interreligious prayer as my dissertation. I'm just finishing up a paper on the interreligious family. It seems like there's a need for interreligious prayer because there's an increasing number of interreligious families. Recent statistics say that about 40% of marriages taking place are between different Christians or Christian, non-Christian. So that inevitably is something we have to deal with as religious educators, the interreligious family. Some of my work is coming out of Maria Harris's work. One of the forms of religious education is liturgy and prayer, and how that prayer is a form of religious education. And so the interreligious prayer service I offer is one to promote peace and justice, and to bring together the world religions and promote a greater understanding of the interreligious world we live in, that Cassie and Interfaith Youth Corps is working so hard to promote and develop. A general principle I have is this: we believe what we pray what we believe, and we live out what we pray and believe. Now put that theory together into an interreligious prayer service, and you have all of the world religions gathered together to pray, and we pray what we believe what we pray, and then we live that out when we leave the service. I have a desire to go beyond the too easily dismissed claims that such prayer services only water down the traditions into a bland universalism that, in an attempt to be inoffensive, winds up offending everyone. I want to challenge that way of just easily dismissing these services, because it's a lot easier to dismiss them than to actually plan them and do them. Some of the things I want to look at in the course of the paper, and I'd invite your feedback on, are things like the hybridity of religions. The hybridity of religions has to do with challenging any religion that claims to be pure, unadulterated, because we are all made up of our Greco-Roman roots of the various religions that influenced our existence. I'd like to look at the concepts of double belonging, the particular and the universal, interreligious God language and liturgical language. Send it my way, my name and so on is in the program. The whole issue of how we pray, the language we pray with. And I'm interested in questions to be raised. What questions would you put on a survey for people attending an interreligious prayer service to examine their understanding of what in the service was particular, what in the service for them was universal? What did they hear that captures that? The particular of their own denominational or religious understanding and the understanding of the universal. Where do you find that? The prayer service, the center of it, the heart of it, are 9 different religious prayers for peace from 9 different religious traditions. Trying to get all 9 in one space has been a challenge. And then there's been a sacred moment of silence, 10 minutes of sacred silence, which is most profound. It's a little added ritual of either offering up incense, or lighting a candle, or hearing a meditation bowl kick. The vibration of the meditation bowl pervade the room. Then there are some theocentric God prayers that are said, theocentric prayers that are said. So I invite your feedback to this plan to go ahead exploring what some people consider untouchable interreligious prayer, and any feedback that you have regarding that. So thank you.